North Korea's latest attempt to launch another surveillance satellite into orbit ended in a mid-air explosion. This despite likely assistance from Russia. Leader Kim Jong-un, in a rare move, admitted the failure, revealing that it was caused by an engine problem. The satellite launch came just hours after South Korea, Japan, and China adopted a joint declaration after a summit, which the North slammed as an interference in its internal affairs. Amid escalating tensions on the Korean Peninsula, a major defense conference is set to kick off this Friday in Singapore, where defense chiefs of major regional players in the Asia-Pacific will gather to hold talks. On today's Within the Frame, we take a close look at the current security landscape in the region with Brian Myers, professor of international studies at Dongseo University. It's always great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me again.
And joining us from the UK is Dr. John Nilsson-Wright, head of Japan and Korea's program at the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. It's so great to have you with us.
Great to be here too.
All right, let's kick things off with you, Professor Myers. Let's look into why North Korea's latest spy satellite launch has failed. According to various reports, it's almost certain that a team of Russian scientists visited the North and provided technical assistance for the launch. Why do you think it failed, despite Russia's assistance, and how do you assess the current level of North Korea's satellite program?
Well, my understanding of the expert consensus is that the failure of the launch had to do with a new type of engine which was used in the rocket, and that was a liquid oxygen and petroleum or kerosene engine, very different from the one used last November in the launch of the Chalima-1, which was successful. Now, that was hydrazine powered. Now, apparently, liquid oxygen has a lot of advantages. It's cheaper, it's safer, better performance, and so on. But it has to be kept at a really low temperature, and that demands special parts and equipment which can stand that kind of cold. So we mustn't look at this failure and think, the North Koreans are unable to repeat their successes, because in fact, they tried to take a very big step forward here, and I think with more international cooperation than they were used to. South Korean experts say that the fact that the North Koreans even attempted a launch with a liquid oxygen engine like this has to be seen as a big technological advance and as a show of confidence. And it also indicates, and this surprises me a bit because I expected Putin to be a bit more cautious, it indicates that satellite cooperation between Russia and North Korea has been underway in earnest for quite some time now. And it shows that the two countries are probably in this for the long term. The Russians are the leaders in this kind of engine fuel, and they're the only feasible source for engine parts that Kim Jong-un is going to need.
So although the launch failed, it did show some technological advancement. And experts also point out that North Korea is highly likely to have conducted the launch in a hasty manner to coincide with the South Korea-Japan-China summit, which brings us to our next question. Dr. Nilsson-Wright, what's your perspective on the fact that the satellite launch came just a few hours after President Yoon, Prime Minister Kishida, and Premier Lee Chiang concluded their trilateral summit? And do you think Pyongyang achieved its objectives?
Well, I think there are two factors here worth emphasizing. As Professor Myers was pointing out, this has been a long-term aspiration on the part of North Korea to develop its satellite technology. So at one level, we shouldn't exaggerate the significance of the timing. The North Koreans have made it very clear that they will continue to develop this technology. But there's no doubt, I think, that they sought the timing of this event to signal their presence, to attempt to disrupt what they might see as increased cooperation between Beijing, Seoul, and Tokyo. And of course, in some respects, the outcome of this meeting between these three countries, the first time in 4.5 years that they've met as part of the trilateral framework, is a bit of a setback for North Korea. They can see this as evidence that one of their closest partners, China, is working, of course, with other countries with which North Korea has a much more conflicted relationship. Some elements of the discussions, including a commitment on the part of President Yoon and the Chinese to explore the possibility of establishing a 2+2 security dialogue, bringing together defense and foreign ministers of the two countries, may be a source of some anxiety to Kim Jong-un. And therefore, in that respect, despite this launch, President Kim may be continuing to feel some degree of reservation about this close cooperation. Having said that, there are, of course, other indicators that suggest that Beijing and Pyongyang remain still pretty firmly on the same page. It was, of course, at this meeting in Seoul that both the Japanese and the South Koreans sought to condemn the satellite launch. China very conspicuously did not. South Korea and Japan also have called for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, a long-standing objective. The Chinese delegation has not and did not support this initiative. There was a lot of squabbling over the terms of the trilateral joint statement, in which there was no commitment by the three countries to single out North Korea for criticism. And at least according to reports from the South Korean media, some on the South Korean side felt that in a way the Chinese delegation, the Chinese premier, Li Chang, were effectively speaking for North Korea in terms of defending that position. China, of course, has itself reasons to want to disrupt closer alliance cooperation between Japan, South Korea, and, of course, the United States, which has been developing quite considerably since August of last year, the famous Camp David summit, which signaled closer cooperation between the US and its two North Korean allies. So I think this is a mixed record, if you like, for Kim Jong-un. The satellite launch itself, a technical failure, but no sign of real breaking of ties between the Chinese and the North Koreans, and they will continue to want to cooperate as authoritarian regimes that are concerned about the US efforts to shore up its democratic alliances.
Well, North Korea is infamous for its diplomatic tactics, and the launch, although it failed, really threw a wet blanket over the trilateral summit that the Yoon administration has been working very hard to materialize. And Dr. Myers, North Korea was quick to condemn the summit, calling it a blatant challenge to the sovereignty of North Korea and wanton interference in its internal affairs. While some experts say it's rare for the North to openly slam an event attended by China, what's your take on this? Would this summit have an impact on Pyongyang-Beijing relations?
Well, the North's official statement gives South Korea the brunt of the blame for what went on, and it never actually mentions China. But yes, it was still implicitly critical of Beijing because Premier Li Chang was one of only three participants. Now, we never know what goes on in secret diplomacy. And as Dr. Nielsen Wright has just said, China's participation in this summit was a lot more nuanced than our press may indicate. And Beijing and Pyongyang may be in much closer contact behind the scenes. But North Korea at least appears to be angry and disappointed with the Chinese, especially for allowing the word denuclearization into the summit statement. You know, the Chinese called for denuclearization 5 years ago, sure, but the world is a much more tense place right now. And the North Koreans, I think, hoped that China would refrain from appearing to side with South Korea and Japan, these two firm allies of the United States, in regard to North Korea's nuclear program. So the anger strikes me as quite real, even though things could have gone a lot worse for Kim Jong-un. And I think the expression of dissatisfaction reflects Kim Jong-un's confidence in the strength and viability of his growing relationship with Putin. And I think Kim is probably right in believing that a multipolar order is more in North Korea's interests than a bipolar order in which China and the US basically carve the world up among themselves.
Well, Pyongyang and Beijing, they have their complications and conflicting interests, but most pundits also say that the two sides would not want their differences to rise to surface for everyone to see. Now, Dr. Nielsen Wright, North Korea is yet to announce details on its next launch. When do you expect it to come, and what implications would the launch have to regional security depending on the outcome?
Well, timing is obviously a challenging question when it comes to North Korea in terms of anticipating when precisely it might launch. I think one thing is clear. The North Korean government has made it clear that they intend to launch 3 satellites this year. Here we are, halfway through the year. It doesn't really give them many options, and I think there will be pressure on them to find some way of correcting this failure. And don't forget, this is not just a question of launching a satellite. A key question is the satellite itself and the intelligence capabilities that it would give to North Korea. We know from statements in South Korea on the part of the National Intelligence Service, which was able to recover some of the remains from the last launch back in last year in the autumn, the evidence suggests that the satellite technology itself is very rudimentary, notwithstanding that very important cooperation with Putin and with the Russians, on the back, of course, of North Korea's willingness to send munitions to assist the Russians in the conflict in Ukraine. So I think we're going to see continuing pressure and a desire on the part of the North Koreans to enhance its satellite technology capability. It's very important as part of its own assertion of its military strength. This matters in terms of its strategic interests. It matters, of course, in terms of domestic public opinion. The likely consequences of this, if it were to launch again, how would the United States and its allies respond? Well, the Japanese have made it very clear, for example, as they did at the time of the last launch, that they will shoot down any satellite that intrudes into Japanese airspace. And I think that then raises the interesting question about the dangers of escalation. We've seen the two Korean leaders, President Yoon and Kim Jong-un, using quite bold rhetoric. And of course, we saw in the response, just as Professor Myers was noting, the North Koreans have focused very much on the South Korean position. Kim Jong-un has described South Korea's own security provisions, the deployment of aircraft near the DMZ, joint drills with the United States, as in his words, a very dangerous provocation, has accused South Korea, in his words, of hysterical madness. And security analysts worry about the danger of this war of words, if you like, bolstered by, of course, military capabilities, raising the possibility of escalation and conflict through miscalculation. I think we should keep that very much in mind. Of course, in all of this, there's the electoral calendar to consider, the November elections in the United States. To what extent will Kim Jong-un be concerned or eager to ensure that his more belligerent posture doesn't undermine the possibility of a Trump victory, which, of course, is something that Kim Jong-un is likely to want to welcome and, if anything, encourage.
Meanwhile, Professor Myers, over 260 balloons from North Korea carrying trash and excrement had been detected across South Korea. I hope you didn't come across any there in Busan. The South Korean military urged the North to stop such inhumane and low-level actions that threaten the safety of South Korean people. What do you make of this?
Well, as much as I sympathize with the South Korean NGOs that launch balloons into North Korea, I've always thought that that kind of activity can have unintended consequences. A balloon can be mistaken for something else by the North Koreans along the DMZ, where everybody is on edge. It can fall on the highway and cause a car accident. It can fall on a power line and start a fire. And now we see, now the shoe is on the other foot, we see how unsettling it is when hundreds of balloons are sent into South Korea. So in that sense, I have to admit, I think the regime in Pyongyang has made a legitimate point quite effectively. I believe in free speech. I believe in transmitting propaganda into North Korea over the airwaves. But, in the United States, you can't just be launching ad balloons or leaflet balloons. You're going to get in trouble with your jurisdiction. And I think this kind of tit for tat with balloons going back and forth over the DMZ can end very badly. I realize that here in South Korea, this is not done by the government. It's done by NGOs. But I would hope that the South Korean authorities can find some understanding with those NGOs that maybe they should go about activities that are less dangerous.
South Korea last saw North Korea send garbage balloons in 2016. That's 8 years ago. Now, while questions are arising why they've sent them now at this particular time, South Korea's presidential office said today that it's part of North Korea's psychological warfare. And staying with you, Dr. Myers, South Korea will hold the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council for the month of June. What's expected to take center stage during the first meeting, and what role do you expect South Korea to play as the chair?
Well, it's only for 1 month, so we can't expect too much. But it's a good opportunity for South Korea, I think, to live up to its rhetoric about becoming a global pivotal state, in other words, a middle power, which it really hasn't shown many signs of being for the past few years. Under President Yoon, South Korea has mainly been concerned with displaying its loyalty to Washington and firming up the military alliance instead of coming up with multilateral initiatives or doing the other things that we associate with middle power diplomacy. Now, South Korea has made clear that it's going to focus the Security Council's attention on the problem of cybersecurity, which I think is a good idea because this is an issue in regard to which a consensus is perhaps easier to reach. Of course, North Korea is a big source of cyber attacks and the main concern from South Korea's perspective, but I don't think that Russia's support for Pyongyang would necessarily extend to blocking some sort of concerted UN action on that front. And again, on the other hand, it's just 1 month, and we can't expect South Korea to accomplish too much during that time.
Dr. Nielsen Wright, an annual security conference, the Shangri-La Dialogue, will kick off this Friday in Singapore. Defense chiefs of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan are set to hold a three-way meeting. What are the key watch points?
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of critical issues. One, of course, that looms large in the minds, I think, of defense planners is the situation over Taiwan. We've seen the Chinese government carrying out significant military exercises near Taiwan in response, of course, to the election of the Taiwanese president, President Lai. This has been seen as an attempt by China to punish, if not intimidate, the Taiwanese government. Japan has wider concerns over its security situation in the East China Sea. The presence of a Chinese maritime buoy in Japan's exclusive economic zone is raising real concerns on the part of Japanese defense planners. So coordination between the US and Japan and South Korea in dealing with those proximate security concerns is very real, but also the broader question of the geopolitics, sending a signal to the Chinese, seeking support, if possible, to try and decouple China from its support for Putin over Ukraine. This has been part of the diplomacy of President Yoon. In his meeting with the Chinese premier in Seoul, he urged that China should, in his words, play the role of a bastion of peace. It's an attempt, I think, in a way to try and appeal to the Chinese to act in, if anything, in a sort of mediating capacity, both when it comes to Europe, but of course also over North Korea. And that's why this question of how close Beijing and Pyongyang remain, which is a source of concern to President Kim, is a critical issue. I think we'll also see, very importantly, much closer cooperation between Japan and South Korea, consistent with President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida's efforts to bolster the bilateral relationship. I understand that one of the key issues that will emerge is the possibility of re-establishing active defense meetings between uniformed personnel from South Korea and Japan. Much of that has been stymied as a result of an incident in 2018 when the Japanese accused a South Korean Navy ship of locking its radar on a Japanese self-defense vessel. Those issues have been, at a practical level, a source of disagreement between the two militaries, and we may see on the side.
We apologize. We're experiencing some technical problem here. Until we get a hold of Dr. John Nielsen Wright again. Dr. Nielsen Wright, can you hear me?
I can. Did we lose the connection?
We did. There was a slight technical glitch. And to continue on with what you were saying.
I'm not sure where I lost the connection, but I was explaining that perhaps another critical issue that will be a source of cooperation will be between the Japanese and the South Korean defense communities. And this is an attempt to move beyond an incident in 2018, which was a source of disagreement between the two countries, when the Japanese government accused the South Korean Navy of locking on its radars, its maritime radar technology on a Japanese self-defense force vessel. From this, I think we may see an agreement to strengthen bilateral cooperation. And all of this is part of a wider discussion about how to enhance practical cooperation in addressing those maritime security threats that I mentioned.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin will also hold a one-on-one with his Chinese counterpart, Admiral Dong Jun, during the Shangri-La Dialogue. Professor Myers, what issues would top the agenda and what significance would the talks hold amid intensifying conflict between the two superpowers?
Well, I can imagine they're going to have to talk about Ukraine and Gaza to some extent, but the top issue is going to have to be Taiwan, because as Dr. Nielsen Wright was just saying, the Chinese have been conducting military exercises around the island in order to, quote unquote, punish Taiwan for what they see as the separatism of Taiwan's new leader. And those exercises, of course, resulted in Taiwan scrambling fighter jets and so on. So tensions have really been running high. And for that very reason, though, I think it's likely that China and the US have already been discreetly communicating for the past few days anyway. So that the main news value of these talks during the Shangri-La dialogue may lie in the impression of the bilateral relationship which the two envoys agreed to convey to the outside world. You know, there have been fireworks in diplomatic meetings between the two countries during the Biden administration, but I don't expect them this time. Both Washington and Beijing are looking to improve the relationship. So I don't think the conflict between these two superpowers really is intensifying. And Taiwan itself doesn't want any more trouble, of course. So I would expect both the Chinese and the American envoys to make very careful diplomatic remarks in which they talk rather vaguely about how productive the talks were.
They have a pile of issues at hand, from the Taiwan issue to China's alleged support to Russia in its fight against Ukraine. The talks, of course, won't resolve those flashpoint disputes, but is expected to help in averting unwanted clashes. All right, we'll leave our discussion there. Thank you so much, Professor Myers and Dr. Nilsson Wright, for making time for us and sharing your valuable insights.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.